our
Bismillah,
Rasul.
alhamdulillah, wassalatu
The
wassalamu ala
same way, my
rasulillah.
dear brothers and sisters,
This
this body,
session
this
is
life, this system of earth
focused on
and sky, this system will
initiating
only behave in the
about
best manner when
three to
it is
four
applied
gatherings
through the ways of the
that
deen,
revolve
the
around
ways
looking
of
at
the
the book
sharia,
Maqasid
through the
al-Sawm,
commandments
or
of
the
Allah,
objectives of
through the
fasting by
sunnat of
Sheikh
Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Is
So my dear
Abdul
brothers
Salam.
and elders, deviating even a
He was one of the
millimeter from
ulama that was
this
known in
lifestyle
particular
of Rasulullah,
for writing on
deviating
the
even a
Maqasid of the
second
Sharia
from the
and
commandments of
for
Allah
writing
is
on
nothing but towards
the
loss.
principles of weighing harm and
Nothing but
benefit,
towards loss. So
and
my dear
even the
brothers
idea
and
that the
elders,
Sharia comes to
this
serve
is the
human
life of
interests.
success. This is the life of
So he brings that flavor,
of,
alaikum
of
salam. He
peace.
brings that
This is
flavor
La
to the
ilaha illallah,
discussion on fasting.
So my dear
And
brothers
his
and sisters,
goal
what is La ilaha
is to
illallah? We all know this.
talk
We
about
all know La ilaha illallah. Our kids
the
know La ilaha
relationship
illallah.
of fasting
But
to
what is La ilaha illallah? There is
Iman and to the
nothing
life of the soul.
worthy of worship except Allah.
So he begins the book
There is no creator
with the
except
Bismillah.
Allah. There
He
is
says
no
Bismillahir Rahmanir
sustainer
Rahim,
except
and then he sends
Allah.
salawat on
There
the
is
Prophet
no
Muhammad
protector
sallallahu alaihi
except
wasallam.
Allah. There's no one who owns us except Allah. My dear brothers and
Now,
sisters, this is La
after
ilaha.
that, it's questionable whether the what comes in the text is written by him or not, because it appears that it was what comes in the text from the introductory perspective. It looks like it was a student that maybe wrote some notes down or wrote what was being said, because he says قال الشيخ والفقيه الإمام والعالم سيد الفاضل مفتي المسلمين بقية السلف الصالح عز الدين أبو محمد عبد العزيز بن عبد السلام. So obviously that's not the Sheikh talking. So we'll go with the fact that the Bismillah is established and the salawat is sent on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we'll retract to say that the Shaykh said that, only for the sake of keeping in tune with the issue of authentication. We always want to see if a book is attributed to a scholar. That's a good methodology. If it's attributed to the scholar, we want to see if actually he did write it. And if something is said in the text, we always want to separate between what he said and someone else said. And that's a principle and methodology that's used across the board. Why? Because it always allows us to have some principles in dealing with the information that we receive. And that's the same technique that was used by the ulama when it came to dealing with the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They didn't attribute to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam something that wasn't something that he did not say, or something that he did not do. And in that way, the Muslims always had a way of having a barrier between that which is the teaching of Islam as far as revelation is concerned, and the teaching of Islam as far as what the ulama and others have written about Islam as a way to explain what was given to them. And that's an important principle, because in that way there's no confusion. And that's why even you find that the Sunnah was written in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it was always separated from the Quran. So those people who accuse, especially you find in the university systems and the study of Islam, there's always this doubt that's placed upon the authenticity of the prophetic Sunnah, and they tried at one time to put doubt into the reality of the Quran, to claim that the Quran was not authentic and so on and so forth. But for the majority of non-Muslim scholars, they have somewhat of a consensus that the Quran came to us in its earliest form. So that means that the Quran is as it was when it originally was written. They don't believe, of course, that it's revelation, but the issue of authentication is important. So we even applied that principle even down to the writings of the ulama. That way, we're always on solid ground. We're always on solid ground. And so those people who say then that the Muslims don't have a principled scholarship, and that the Muslims base their deen on emotion and superstition, or practices which have no basis or no ability to be authenticated, that's not necessarily correct. From early on, you find this consciousness among the Muslim scholars to look at things from an objective perspective And that's why many hadith were not accepted into the corpus or into the body of hadith literature. Because they had that critical scholarship, they had the critical mindset. But it's not the critical mindset that you find today which lands people in doubt to the point where they have nothing to stand upon. It was a critical mindset which was aiming at uncovering or discovering what is true. Right? And so that's kind of what we can gain from that reflection. He begins with Kitabu Sawm, the title. Then he says, فِيهِ عَشَرَةُ فُصُولٍ, that there's 10 sections. Okay, the first section is pertaining to the obligation of fasting. Now what the Shaykh does is he said that there's an obligation. يعني الفصل الأول في وجوبه. So the first section is pertaining to fasting being an obligation. So he systematically is presenting the idea that the objectives of fasting, the discussion that revolves around that, is not going to be a discussion which is not systematic. It's not going to be a discussion just based on an emotional encouragement, but it's going to be a scholarly presentation, right? But at the same time, it's not just going to be intellectual. Right? What's implied here is that it's going to encompass the meaning of Islam or Deen as is presented in the Hadith of Jibreel. It means you're going to have some elements of the discussion that are going to pertain to action to Islam, some elements that are going to pertain to Iman or to belief, some elements that are going to pertain to Ihsan or our relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Right? So he begins by quoting the Quran. He says, قال الله تعالى وعز وجل يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون. So in this, now he's bringing in evidence which is called a detailed evidence, right? But what he's teaching us from the ayat by prefacing it with the title that this section is pertaining to the fasting, to the obligation of it, by saying to the obligation of it, fi wujubihi, he automatically is teaching us that the ayat is implying or is clearly denoting, right? Is clearly denoting that fasting is an obligation. So the ruling is there pertaining to the fasting. Then he brings the ayat of the Quran, right, to show what is the basis. Is it something that people are making up? Is it something, where did he get it? Right? The basis is the Quran itself. But then how do we understand the Quran? Is the fast, something that people should do if they want to do it, or negate it if they want to negate it? No. He says the correct meaning then. All this stuff is kind of assumed, right? It's an assumed, it's comprehended. There's an assumption on how to understand it. So immediately after he says this section is pertaining to fasting, to the obligation of it, immediately he follows it up with the Quran, justifying the position, right? Because you can't just say something is an obligation in Islam without having something to fall on, or else it just become people legislating from their own whims and desires and intellect. So from there on, what he'll do is he'll give a series of other proofs that relate to fasting. Here he begins with the Quran itself, because the Quran is the source of Islamic legislation. Then he clarifies the ayat by following up with a series of a hadith. So in the ayat is calling out to the believers. It's calling out to the believers. And it is saying that fasting has been legislated upon you, O believers, right? This ayat, we heard the ayat many times. We hear it around this time of the year, when Ramadan is coming. And many of us are familiar with it. But check out the reflection. He says, O you believers, fasting has been legislated upon you as it was upon the people that came before you. And then he will emphasize the last part, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, that perhaps you may gain in taqwa, that it may be the case that if you fast, and you fast correctly, and you take the right course of action in fasting, have the right attitude, make the right effort, have the right focus, that it may be the case that this may be a way of you gaining in proximity to Allah by obedience to Allah. And then he defines what taqwa is in this case. But that's the general meaning. He's going to go into that. Then he says, now he himself is clarifying for us regarding the meaning. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. But what is he saying? Because taqwa usually has a number of different definitions. Many of these definitions, the people, they always don't understand really how to implement taqwa. We hear in English language it's translated sometimes as God consciousness or God fearing, that type of thing. But when you go deep into the books of tafsir, you find actually that the meaning of taqwa, one of the meanings, because it has a series of meanings, the Arabic language is very rich. This is why it's important to latch on to the sources of Islam in the original language, because the meaning is so robust that it gives us a way of looking at the reality from a lot of different angles, so that is covering the whole reality of our existence as a human being, right? So yeah, you have the spiritual inclination, and yeah, there's this concept of God-fearingness. But how do you get there? You understand what I'm saying? So sometimes that's what happens with some of the definitions when they're translated. We begin to lose the meanings. But when we go to the Arabic, it's not just telling us God consciousness and fearing Allah. It's telling us how. It's telling us how. You find some of the scholars of tafsir, they will talk about taqwa as the implementation of the commands of Allah. Right? So that becomes the reality, that we're implementing the commands of Allah, seeking the pleasure of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. Here, the Shaykh, he's saying something different. He's saying that here taqwa, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, and then he follows up, and nar, the hellfire, by means of your fast. By means of our fasting, we're implementing the reality of the Quran, because there's a command in the Quran for this ayah to be practiced. And then what we're aiming at is that we ourselves are safeguarding ourselves from the hellfire. And then he'll go into that, right? But that's the general concept that he wants to lay down. He goes into the details of what that means, why, and so on and so forth. It's not just a matter of just fear, right? But he goes into that. He brings to the table an understanding which appeals to the intellect, but it's not so rationalized that it deviates from the text. It's not just speculation. It's still relying on the text, but what he's doing is bringing out the meanings from different ahadith and different ayat, and then he's talking basically about how this ayat, when it's understood through the sunnah, how it relates to ourselves developing as Muslims. How it relates to ourselves developing as Muslims in regards to something which is very hard to confront, our own desires. Right? So basically then he's prefacing the reality by saying that, there's a track here, that without taqwa, that the path that we're kind of headed on, there's an implication here, that, and it's possibly that we can read it this way, that the path that humanity is headed on is toward the hellfire, unless they have some way to guide themselves. And that's established in Surah Al-Asr, right? Innal insana fi khusr, that humanity is at a loss, right? And that's the program. It's not a negative reality, but what it is it's for the Muslim is a reality of understanding that this world is one which is in the control of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So the meaning remains with Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So that way we understand the world then is that we are under the dominion of Allah. And when we deviate from the command of Allah, then there's a ramification for that. Now, maybe some people say, well, you contradict yourself because that is negative. Yeah, maybe. Okay, now for the non-Muslim, it may be a different reality. It may be a different reality, because that may seem like it's negative. Right? For us, we understand history, we understand the reality of the world as being an abode in which we come into it for a short period of time. And in that period of time, there's things that manifest themselves, and all of that revolves around our iman. All of it revolves around our iman, and what's in our hearts is tested. Right? So the dunya is not an abode that we stay in forever. So the reality is that if we don't attach ourselves to Allah, our hearts to Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, when we come to believe in them, there's a consequence for that disobedience. People have freedom to do what they will. So that's the reality. So لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ النَّارَ بِصَوْمِهِ. So that perhaps that it may be the case that by fasting that we safeguard ourselves from the hellfire. Because fasting in this case is fasting. In this case is what is a reason for achieving the forgiveness of our sins, the sins which what would what obligate the hellfire upon us. So he's automatically he's showing us, look, it's not just the issue. Like for instance, I'll read the hadith first. The hadith is in the Sahihain, and it reads that Islam. I'll try to summarize that we can move a little faster. Islam is established upon 5 pillars. Right. This narration is in Bukhari Muslim. Firstly, to worship Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and to disbelieve in everything other than Allah as those things having the divinity or sovereignty. Now, in other words, to believe in Tawheed. And believing in Tawheed means negating divinity or negating the rights of Allah to anything that's created. Only Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is deserving of being considered God. And everything that means. Right? So the hadith here, it reads a little different than the hadith that we find in the Arba'in Nawawiyya, because it doesn't talk about the issue of disbelieving in everything other than Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And to establish the salah and to pay the zakat and to make hajj and to fast Ramadan. So there is just a clear obligation. That fasting Ramadan is built, it's one of the pillars of Islam. Islam is built upon it. It's clear obligation. But no, the Shaykh doesn't want us to reflect on just it being an obligation. He wants us to reflect on the fact that the fasting, now let's go back to the explanation that he was giving of the ayah, that we are safeguarding against the hellfire. Why? Because fasting, right, Ramadan is one of the causes for Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala forgiving us our sins, that otherwise if we don't gain that forgiveness by Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, then what's necessitated is being punished in the hellfire. So there's an angle here which is not popular in the contemporary age, is to talk about the hellfire, to talk about the hereafter. You know, that's a reality. And in this age, that's not popular stuff. You know, people don't want to hear that from religion. They want to hear an orientation which is just encouraging you in a self-help type of manner, right? But the negative side, in other words, the consequences to our deeds, we believe that the hellfire is a reality, right? The hellfire, it's a reality. But at the same time that we acknowledging that it's a reality, we are discovering here that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is giving us a means to evade while we're here in the earth. And so that's the first thing that the Shaykh wants us to understand, that fasting is a means of forgiveness. Implied in that is what? That Allah is merciful. That Allah is forgiving. Right? It's not just that Allah is legislating. It's not just that Allah is all powerful. It's that Allah is forgiving. Right? And anybody who encounters trouble in the reality of life, there's boundaries in human interactions. And sometimes if we cross certain boundaries, we encounter trouble. We get in problems. Right? And so here it's just like, okay, we sinned. If we sinned against Allah, now in the spiritual world, we are encountering a boundary. We violated a boundary which we say we believe in Allah. Okay, Allah established a boundary. That boundary is what? Don't do this or don't do that. Right? Whether it's a violation of the right of Allah or a right of a human being. So when we do violate, now we are encountering a ramification. The ramification is that we have a sin before us. Right? What happens? The ramification is here. We have a sin before us, and that sin, as we understand in the holy books, will lead us to the hellfire. Unless there's some way to repair our relationship, because we're damaging our relationship. Right? Through sins, we're damaging our relationship. So here then, it shows that Allah is merciful. Allah gives us a way to amend. Right? Allah gives us a way to amend, to purify our hearts. Allah gives us a way to do that spiritual kind of like spring cleaning type of concept. So then he goes into establishing after establishing the obligation, to talk about the virtues, right? So at this point it's very optimistic. The way that he's talking about the fasting is to encourage us to engage in the fasting so that we can attain to Allah's mercy, right? Also, that we gain the pleasure of Allah by following the command of Allah, because Allah legislated. Right? Once we believe in Allah, then the consequence of that is following the ordinances of Allah, what Allah has legislated. Staying away from the prohibitions. But staying away from the prohibitions takes some work, and he'll talk about that a little bit. That's part of the goal of fasting. Sometimes we don't we're not cognizant of that reality. Being a Muslim needs some effort, right? But then how are we able to engage in being a Muslim? In the reality of life, when we're tested in this direction, when we're tested in that direction, when we find the imperfection within our own character, when we find the habit that leads us in this direction or in that direction, and we become overpowered by our own weaknesses. That's part of what he wants to discuss in this reflection on fasting. He just doesn't. He wants you to know that Ramadan is an obligation. He wants you to know that Ramadan is a means for forgiveness. We all know that, right? But now he wants to encourage you that the fasting has some benefits to it. One is that it raises us in station, because the fasting, what it does is it removes us from our animal nature and makes us akin to the spiritual world. Remember that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala doesn't eat. Right? So that's one of the qualities of Allah, that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is self-sustaining. So the fasting person in that sense is imitating that reality. The fasting person is imitating the reality of the angels. So now we're moving from the physical and carnal realm, the realm of the body and the animal instincts, and we're moving to a more angelic realm. Right? Another thing is that fasting is a means to extinguish, those things, extinguish wrongdoing, or the removal of sin. And this is the point, kasr al-shahawat, and that's what we were talking about before. That now when it comes to how we are able to gain some self-knowledge, how do we work with our own selves, the fasting is a means for breaking desire, so that we're in charge of our own selves, right? And it's a time period in which sadaqah is increased. It's a time period in which the opportunities for obedience are increased. It's a time period for giving thanks to the one, yani alam al-khafiyat, sorry, to give shukr, or to be thankful to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, the one who knows the subtleties of the world, who knows the secrets that we have, the one who knows who we are when no one else knows. Right? And then now he comes up with something which is very deep. وَإِنْزِجَارُ عَنْ خَوَاتِ الْمَعَاسِي وَالْمُخَالَفَاتِ. And the word inzijar is an important word. He's saying that fasting gives us the ability to stop and prevent, to occlude, right, and eliminate those thoughts which are sinful, and those thoughts which lead us to going against the deen itself. So not only did he talk about desire, now he's talking about even those thoughts, the whisperings, right, that come from ourselves. And he'll also talk about the whisperings that come from shaitan. So now he goes into to explain everything one by one. So as far as the raising of our station in the spiritual sense, right? As far as our ability to be raised in rank, he bases it on the hadith that says, if Ramadan comes, that the gates of Jannah are open and the gates of the hellfire are closed, right? And then the shayateen are restrained, and he'll discuss every part of the hadith as well known, right? But now he wants to talk about just this one point, and this is the technique of the ulama, that they'll talk in a general sense and then they'll come back and explain with details, right, if there's time, right? But you got a general meaning. Now he's going into the detail, because before he said that the virtues of fasting pertain to raising us in station, right? rafu darajat. Right? So now he bases on that hadith. And then he bases it on another hadith, which is a hadith Qudsi. That all of the actions of the children of Adam are for them. That the children of Adam, when they act, those acts are for their own benefit, right? Except fasting. Right? Except fasting. In the case of fasting, you find that Allah even fasting is for the benefit of the human being. But here the hadith, what it wants to do is what was being aimed at in the hadith is showing that fasting is distinct from other actions. Fasting before Allah wa ta'ala is a distinct form of ibadah. All actions that he talks about, that Shaykh is rahmatullahi alayh, that all actions are rewarded. So fasting being rewarded, it's just like any other act of ibadah. But Allah wa ta'ala is indicating something about fasting which distinguishes fasting from other acts of ibadah. But in general, when we come to reflect and we come to think, every act of ibadah is rewarded. Every act of ibadah is beneficial to us. But here for a specific reason which we'll encounter in a little bit, Allah wa ta'ala is telling us that all acts that the children of Adam perform, right? Those acts are for their own benefit, right? But fasting is distinguished because fasting is for Allah wa ta'ala, and Allah wa ta'ala is the one who takes it upon himself to reward fasting. We know Allah wa ta'ala takes it upon himself to reward every act of ibadah. But here Allah wa ta'ala is distinguishing fasting because fasting really is not really known what the reward of fasting is. It's not indicated to. These are things that we know. These are things that we grow up with. These are things that we hear on a constant basis. But the purpose of this type of gathering is to prepare ourselves for Ramadan and put ourselves back in tune with that reality. That Allah wa ta'ala is saying in the hadith Qudsi that's transmitted by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam something about fasting. And what's being said is that fasting is a unique act of ibadah. That Allah is distinguishing it as something of a special relationship between the servant of Allah and Allah. And that's something that has to be reflected upon. Fasting is a special type of ibadah which Allah Himself is indicating to His special features. And Allah wa ta'ala is also calling our attention that the reward of fasting is really only known unto Allah. Even we don't really know what the reward of fasting is except that which has been designated. And we know that fasting under the proper condition is that which leads us to Jannah. And Allah wa ta'ala, He says in the hadith Qudsi, by the wording of the Prophet Muhammad, وَالصِّيَامُ جُنَّةٌ, that the fasting is like a fortress. It's a protection. And then it continues, the hadith continues. So in the day that you're fasting, don't engage in language, right? Now we talked about the desire. We talked about the issue of controlling desire. We talked about the issue of thinking, thoughts, whispering. Now look at what he says in language which is foul. And don't, in other words, don't engage with each other in language which is really not befitting of the Muslim, right? And if a person were to abuse you or curse you or insult you or vilify you or offend you in their wording, in their speaking and communicating to you, don't raise your voices, right, to counter them. Because now there's an implication here. that raising of the voice and that countering now is the beginning of a conflict, right? So prevent yourself from falling or taking that course of action which will put you in conflict with others when they themselves are not comporting themselves in a mannerism which is modeled by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's not that it's allowable outside of Ramadan. Some of the ulama put, they draw our attention to that. It's not to say that because this is forbidden in Ramadan is, outside of Ramadan, it's allowable. No, is that what's being emphasized here is that Ramadan is a school to teach us how to be Muslims, to renew our reality of being a Muslim once again. That our thinking, right? That our actions, right? That our desires should all conform to the reality of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in that model. So then it tells us, if someone were to curse you or to offend you or to fight with you, respond to that person, right? That I'm in the condition and in the state of fasting. And there's a lot of emphasis that's placed on that point. But what do you do if you're dealing with a non-Muslim or others? They don't understand that reality. So then that calls for us to be of the best of characters, right? Because now you're put, especially look, when you're fasting, when you're without food and drink and you're tired, you're in a position in which is easy to offend you, is easy to tick you off because you don't have the physical strength really to be able to safeguard. You don't have really the mental energy there to really to be able to think in 20 seconds ahead of the other person and draw that whole scenario like, you know what, I don't want to go there with that person because if I were to go there with that person, then A or B or C might happen. You don't have that capacity in the same way. So it's drawing our attention that indirectly we may be able to say that in that state of fasting, we're susceptible to being in a position which we can be manipulated. We can be carried by another person and drawn into their madness and then get out of character. And when we look at today's reality, we look at domestic violence and we look at a lot of the problems that happen between people fighting, and a lot of it comes back to this, that the way that people are thinking about engaging with each other, a lot of times the thinking is not controlled. So automatically it leads to a situation in which people, they enter into conflict because they're drawn into that conflict by the emotion of the moment, by the madness of the moment. So the fasting here then and the etiquettes that revolve around the fasting are drawing our attention to, be careful in this situation, right? We're being forewarned of this reality. That if a person were to engage in vilifying, insulting you, and entering into a conflict with you, remain in that state of control, because that's what fasting is. Fasting is a state of control with spiritual attunement. We're attuned to a higher reality, right? And that's the obedience of Allah Ta'ala. And so then it's teaching us how to engage with others. And so then here to emphasize with the Muslim, explain to the Muslim, if you're dealing with the Muslim, I'm fasting. And if that Muslim is a person of knowledge, that Muslim should know what is the proper etiquette and what is the proper behavior, right, that should be engaged in that state of fasting, and they should call themselves to account and decrease and de-escalate the reality. So the reality of their own behavior and their own thinking, so that it doesn't lead to that conflict which kind of violates spiritually the reality of fasting. So Allah Ta'ala, He legislated fasting for various purposes. So here is saying that the smell of the person that's fasting, right, is something which is beloved to Allah Ta'ala. But here, the reality is that there's something missing in this statement. It's actually the reward for the person that's fasting is more beloved to Allah Ta'ala, right? It's more grand. It has more stature than the smell of misk, right? And you know that, within Islamic culture, misk and those and like oud and those type of things, they have a lot of value. They have a lot of value. So it's drawing our attention to something which is beautiful in the dunya, something which is basically, this is like the honor of those people who have stature. If we think about the reality of misk and the reality of oud, the reality of these things are the reality. It gives us stature. Even in the Muslim community, we know that those who have the pure oud, they're investing money into that, and it's not a small amount of money, right? It's a large amount of money. So it's drawing our attention that this look at the parallel here. That misk is something that smells good, and the breath of the fasting person is something that smells foul, because the person is emitting toxins and other things from their body. So it's like Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is drawing our attention to, don't think that this state, which may seem a state where there's no dignity to it, a state which is somewhat, in some ways it looks foul, don't think that state is not beloved to Allah, because that's a state of obedience to Allah. Whereas a person can have misk, the person can have oud, a person can have the proper attire, a person can manifest themselves to others in a particular behavior, right? But it's not what is beloved to Allah. You see the parallel that we want to draw here? The parallel that we want to draw here is that sometimes what is given value is not what's given value to in the eyes of the people is not necessarily what's given value by Allah. So people will want to draw, they will want to not draw near to you in that state where you may not smell well, right? So again, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is preparing us even at that level to understand that everything about fasting is beloved, including the foulness of the smell. Now, there's adab to fasting, that you're using the miswak, and sure, we should fast in a way which we're not demonstrating that we're fasting. Sure, we should be clean, we should have clean attire. Sure, we should perfume ourselves. But that's not the point. The point here is to be sensitive to this reality, right? That judging by appearances is different than judging by the Sharia. Intellectually, it's true that the person that has bad breath, who wants to be around that person? Whereas the person who smells good, they're attractive. But Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is telling us that in this state, that person that's fasting, that person that's aiming for the face of Allah and for the pleasure of Allah. And there's other things that come along with that later on. He'll talk about the issue of leaving your desire, right? The Shaykh will talk about how Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala mentions that the slave of mine has left his desire for me. So Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is encouraging us on a lot of different levels, right, to prepare ourselves for judging by the Sharia in that sense. So here the Sharia is dictating to us the reality of actions, not what we see by appearance, not what we think pleasurable to be something that's honorable in the sight of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, but what's honorable in the sight of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is that which Allah legislated for us in this case. And so Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala talks about this point, that the smell of the mouth of the fasting person is more beloved than the smell of misk on the day of Qiyamah. Some of the ulama, they debated whether it was only on the day of Qiyamah or in the hereafter as well. But that comes along because you explained the hadith. So he says, for the fasting person, there's two moments of enjoyment, right, or two moments of joy, you should say, right? The moment in which the fast is ended, and then what the fasting leads to, and this is what we have to attune ourselves to. وَإِذَا لَقِيَ رَبَّهُ فَرِحَ بِصَوْمِهِ. If a person encounters Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, then they find joy in that fasting, right? Because of the end result of that fast. And then again, there's an encouragement here, another hadith, that every action of the children of Adam is increased in his reward from 10 to 700 times. But Allah Ta'ala says, except the fasting. Because the fasting is something that is designated for Allah Ta'ala, and Allah has specified, and Allah has taken special charge of rewarding that fasting. So it's left as something precious, in the sense that its reward is unnamed. So it's almost like the reward is unlimited. And so here it goes. So the slave of Allah Ta'ala leaves his desire and leaves food for the sake of Allah Ta'ala. يدعو شهواته وطعامه من أجله. So the goal becomes only for Allah. See, in that state now, there's no, the goal is only for Allah in that state. Right? And when it only becomes for Allah Ta'ala, right, the impurities are removed from the act of ibadah, because sincerity becomes more manifest. And then he quotes another hadith. These are all points of encouragement. That indeed in Jannah there is a gate, the gate of Rayyan. And this gate is designated because on the day of judgment, those people who have made fasting a way of their life, a way of life, or part of their life, not just fasting Ramadan, but also throughout the year. There are different occasions for fasting. That those people have a special gate by which they enter. And no one enters with them unless they're from that group that has that quality, the quality of fasting. In other words, Allah Ta'ala is distinguishing the person that is accustomed to fasting, a person that's fasting for Allah Ta'ala, and gives them this rank. Again, it goes back to the issue of raising station. That fasting raises our station. Even to the point that gate, there's something that, there's a reality, the way that the gate is being the painted is like it's alive. It's like if the gate is alive, the gate of Rayyan, that it calls out saying, where's the fasting people? Right? So there's a metaphysical reality to that, right? That there's an attraction there between that gate and the gate of the people of fasting. There's a spiritual relationship there. And then once that group of people that are the people of fasting enters in, the gate closes. That's to indicate the rank. That's to indicate the importance of fasting. That's to indicate the reality of fasting. Right? And then another, he brings another narration, but it says the same thing. It says that there's a gate called Rayyan, and it calls out to the people that are fasting. The difference between this narration and the other, it says وَمَنْ دَخَلَهُ لَمْ يَظْمَأْ أَبَدًا. That person that enters there, they will never suffer thirst. The thirst that they indicate to is extreme thirst. So it's showing again, it's indicating to the reality of fasting on a lot of different levels. On the spiritual level, on the intellectual level, on the level of desire. It's also indicating to fasting things that come along with fasting, like the foul odor, like the issue of the fasting that we leave our desire, right? The issue of fasting that we leave essentials like food that we need, drink, which sustains our life. So Allah Ta'ala is encouraging us in that reality, because fasting with no doubt is a struggle. And then now, again, there's another hadith to encourage us. That the people that fast, that the malaika, they pray for them, right? If it be the case that people come into their proximity that are eating and drinking, that at that point in time, even there's a spiritual force, the malaika that are from the unseen, they're praying for you in that moment, because it is a moment of test after all, right? When you see other people eating and enjoying the dunya. These things also can be read into that. That's the reality of life. The reality of life, that here we're living something that's halal. But in the reality of the dunya, as we live in it, we experience in our environment that people enjoy pleasurable things which may be forbidden to us. Right? So again, we're being drawn to an issue of the unseen. When we're tuned in by making an effort toward Allah Ta'ala through our actions, through our discipline, and in the right state of heart, the right state of mind, right? That there's an unseen force which is supportive of us. That the reality of the unseen is supportive of us in doing that good. So we're able to draw strength, right, by that reality. But that requires iman, right? It requires iman on our part. It requires believing. It requires action on our part. And then he goes to talk about, like, okay, that the angels, they pray for the people that are fasting in the case that others are in their proximity in their eating, until what? Those people separate paths, or the people stop eating, and so on and so forth. In regard to the opening of the gates of Jannah, he goes to talk about this in a way which is comprehensible. He says, basically, this is an indication that the increasing of acts of obedience necessitate the opening of the gates of Jannah. And the gates of Jahannam are closed, right? Because at that point in time, what is the case is that sins are decreasing. So as those sins are decreasing, what's necessitated is the closing of the gates of Jahannam. Sorry, the gates of Jahannam closing, or the gates of the hellfire closing. The reason why the gates of Jahannam are closing is because sins are decreasing, right? That the believers in Ramadan has that powerful effect. That you find that people come to the masjid that haven't been coming to the masjid. You find that you gain this energy to go. You find this energy to pray tarawih, and you still carry on with the rest of your life. You find this energy to engage in fasting. You have this commitment to doing this act of ibadah, or even you're just staying away from the basic sins, or even you're decreasing sins, even if you're engaged in sins. So that is the cause of the hellfire closing. That we now are in tune with the reality of iman. Right? It's not really a superstitious type of thing. So in the reality of the shayateen being enchained or being detained, is because now what has happened with the shayateen is that we have separated ourselves from their whisperings. And their whisperings have no real impact over the people that are fasting as they should be. Because they're not inclining, right, to respond to their call. And their call is calling us to sin. So again, he mentions that, now he goes into explanation that in the Hadith Qudsi, when it's related from Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala that the action of the children of Adam, or the son of Adam, is for him except fasting. Fasting is for Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, and Allah indicates that the reward of it is known to him. What's happening here at this point is that there's an honoring of the act of fasting. That fasting is honored because was removed from fasting is the hidden shirk, riyah. Because hunger and thirst, people that want to be full of pride don't what? They don't engage in those type of actions. Right? There's nothing to celebrate there. Right? In that regard. And so he repeats again what was repeated before, that all acts of ibadah are rewarded. There's nothing to be distinguished when we look at fasting and we look at other acts of ibadah. All acts are rewarded. So what's the distinguishing feature of fasting then? Here he says that what's happening is that fasting is given a great position among the acts of ibadah. And Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is designating that the act of fasting is an act which He disposes Himself to the point of taking charge of the person's needs and his reward. Right. So on other occasions, Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, it makes it clear what the reward for the action is. But here Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is constantly drawing our attention to that. And the reason why the fasting is a protection is because it's a protection from the punishment of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. Right? And so in that state of fasting, then we should harness our tongues from that act of speaking, which is considered to be a form of speaking which is deplorable, form of speaking which is not allowable in the Sharia, a form of speaking which opens up to disruption in our relationships with others. And we're called again to the attention of the problem that we have with each other when we engage in a negative way with each other. It ends up being a point of conflict, and then we don't forgive each other, and then the hearts are separated, and then this unity is called for because the people are engaging with each other in a way which it doesn't really allow for them to be of one heart. So it begins with the desire and the tongue and the way that we engage with each other. So then when we're in that state, the Shaykh is just repeating over some of the points that were said before. When we're in that state of fasting and we encounter others and it seems as though we're going to get into a conflict, we should call ourselves to attention so that we know what is the appropriate form of engagement, so that we don't fall in that state of conflict. And as far as moving on a little bit, as far as the joy, the double joy that is associated with fasting, one of those realities that was really not mentioned before, which he mentions now, is that Allah Ta'ala is guiding us to be able to complete an act of ibadah. Complete in the sense that we're not talking about complete and just doing it, no. And to be able to get the whole of the benefit from the act of ibadah, or the act of worship. To be able to engage in an act of worship and really grow in our relationship with Allah Ta'ala. See, sometimes we engage in acts of ibadah from the angle of formality, but the reality we don't experience. And one of the reasons we don't experience that reality is because there's some obstacles in it, whether it's the act of praying, or whether it's the act of zakat, or whether it's the act of fasting, or the act of hajj. Right? There are obstacles sometimes, whether it's showing off, or not focusing, not paying attention, not having a heart in it. Right? But here it's showing that one of the joys, right, that we can experience, that's open to us, that's a spiritual reality, is the joy of having that act of ibadah manifest in such a way in our lives, which the whole of the reality is there before us. Then one of the realities that comes along with that is the entry into Jannah, because fasting is associated with entry into Jannah when it's under the proper conditions. And then lastly, and we'll stop here. As far as the statement that the slave of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, he's leaving his desire and her desire, he's leaving his food. Allah Tabarak wa is a hadith Qudsi, يَدَعُ شَهَوَاتَهُ وَطَعَامَهُ مِنْ أَجْلِي. What it means is that the servant is giving preference to the obedience of Allah over obedience to self. Right? And so there's it's a statement which seems simple, but it's not. Because that's what you call having adab with Allah. Having proper etiquette with Allah. Right? And that's something that we miss. When we sin, we're preferring ourselves and our own destruction to our own salvation, to our own growth, to our own development, to our own happiness. And so what shaitan does, and the shayateen, what they have to do is yuzaynun, they have to embellish, they have to make the reality of that sin look beautiful. They have to catch our eye, so to speak. Shaitan always latches onto our desire because the desire doesn't have an intellect to itself. It's like when you think about Pavlov's dog. In the experiment, the dog salivates when the dog is seeing food. That's an instinctual apparatus that's operating without thought. So sight and smell, the senses, in other words, the senses move us, right? But it's intellect which governs the process so that we don't destroy ourselves. When you think about children, right? Children will engage in activities and they don't look at the consequences. And you look at little boys, they'll climb on something and be ready to jump off, and they don't even think about the consequences, right? So that's the reality of the desire, the reality of the nafs. So here is teaching us that, on another level of human development, which is not talked about in today's time, the spiritual development. It's not just the intellectual development. It's not just career development. It's not just the ability to build a magnificent building or the ability to communicate messages from one part of the world to the other part of the world, almost in a spiritual fashion, almost like in a magical fashion. That stuff is fine and great. But what's missing is this spiritual development, right? And that only comes now where there's some sort of spiritual understanding about how the life of the soul operates. So here in this point, there's something very special about that. That we're looking at basic desires, right? And in dealing with basic desires, there could be sin, or there can be, approximating. We could be approximating to Allah, or we could be coming close to Allah. Just by something as simple as leaving food. Leaving food, it gives us the opportunity or the occasion to spiritually engage, and they're giving preference, right, to the command of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala over ourselves. So he is saying that Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala will reward the person that who is fasting. Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala takes charge. In other words, is having special rank in the sense that you get a special invitation, an honored invitation, an honored station. So here the Shaykh is saying the person who prefers Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, Allah gives that person preference. So that's how we become the friends of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. So according to that station by which the slave of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is preferring Allah to the intensity and the quality, so on and so forth. According to that, that's how our relationship with Allah develops. So some people in the dunya, they sacrifice, like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, sacrifices dunya for the deen. And so here the reality is that the station of Abu Bakr is ranked very high in the Ummah, partly because of that. He preferred Allah, His Messenger, to himself and gained everything after. That's something that has to be understood. It's not easy. That's not easy. In the trials and tribulation of the dunya, what is immediate to us becomes what is of concern, what's before us. But here what we're being taught is that, look, hold on a second. There's a spiritual reality and there's a reality of time which is beyond just what's there in the moment and is beyond the span of your life, because the hereafter comes. Right? The hereafter comes. So here, even we're being encouraged. So the person who was going to engage in the act of disobedience to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and then left that act of disobedience in fear of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, so Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, He tells the angels which record, monitor the affairs of human beings, to count that not as a sin that he had the intention or was concerned with, in engaging in sin, but as a good deed. Because that person has left his desire for the sake of Allah wa Ta'ala. So then that's the point that the Shaykh has gotten us to. That here, one of the things about fasting, aside from solidarity with the poor, aside from self-control, it has a lot to do with retuning our relationship with Allah wa Ta'ala and learning to overcome ourselves. Why? For the sake of loving Allah. It's not just the issue of obedience. Obedience is the foundation, but it's the point of obedience to achieve the love of Allah wa Ta'ala, so that we begin to be attuned to our relationship with Allah, and we begin to model our lives in such a way. I'll put it like this and we can end. Some of the people of ibadah, even those things which were good and permissible, they would abstain from them for the sake of Allah wa Ta'ala. Like there's things that are permissible in the dunya, but I'll give you an example. You may have time to do this or to do that, and you may engage in doing a particular act, and it may be a halal act. But rather than occupy your time with that, you choose to take from that time which you can enjoy yourself, which is halal and is beautiful, something that's legislated for you. It's not something that's haram, but you choose that time to take from that time and spend in the dhikr of Allah wa Ta'ala, or spend in ibadah. So now what you did was you preferred coming close to Allah wa Ta'ala over yourself. You see what I'm saying? So that's the thing. That's the challenge, is how do we encourage the growth of our relationship with Allah, right? In the everyday life. How do we organize our time in such a way that we're thinking about that relationship that we have with Allah wa Ta'ala, right? Not just we can go through the 9 to 5 routine. We may be doing everything that's halal, right? But here we're not talking about the basics. We're talking about attaching our hearts to Allah wa Ta'ala. So then, that being the case, that needs from us a special effort. That needs from us to prefer doing those actions which bring us close to Allah over those actions which just satisfy us and give us our own pleasure, even if those things are halal. I was reading Shaykh Abul rahmatullahi alayhi. He wrote a book about called Sabahat fi Sabr al-Ulama. It's pages that are descriptive of the sabr of the ulama. I just happened to open it. I was moving some books around. It wasn't even intentional. I saw the book, I opened it, but I wasn't actually sitting down saying I'm going to read this book. It wasn't like that. It just came. And there he talked about Walaikum Salam. He in that book, Sheikh Abu rahmatullahi alayhi, he talked about Sheikh Islam ibn Taymiyyah, and he said that it was a story for him. It was almost like it was Ibn Taymiyyah talking to Ibn Qayyim. And in that story, it shows that Ibn Taymiyyah used to stay after Fajr to almost midday, and from Fajr time. It's like way before, about before Dhuhr almost. In dhikr. He used to spend it in dhikr. And then he was telling Ibn Taymiyyah was telling Ibn Qayyim that is his spiritual feeding. That he doesn't feel, he's not feeding himself, he's not nourishing, sustaining himself unless he has that time with Allah. Right? And that's how some of the ulama, they do that, like after Fajr or after Asr, they designate a time which is not to do anything else except maybe just sit and make dhikr of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. Some people have a program where in the middle of the night, right before Fajr, they wake up and they make 2-3 rak'ats or whatever it is that they make. And just to have that relationship with Allah. It's different than reading the Quran. Right? It's different than making dua. It's different than making salah. It's a time period where it's just you and Allah. In the sense of that you're sitting there in Allah's presence and you're expecting from Allah. Sure, reading the Quran is you and Allah, is the speech of Allah. Sure, salah is you and Allah, is you engaging with Allah. But no, what you find is that the ulama, they gave themselves that time. And the reason why I mentioned that is because we live in a fast-paced society. We have a lot of worries and we're hit with a lot of problems. And you need that time to disengage, that time to be restful, that time to be calm, so that the heart is at ease. And then from there, with good deeds, and we're always engaged in that struggle with the self. From there, what happens is that the peace and the tranquility of Allah, descend. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.